A melting glacier just gave up a 5,000-year-old shoe. This is not an isolated find, but a single page torn from a vast frozen library. As alpine ice retreats, it is exposing a lost map of prehistoric mountain trade routes, rewriting the story of early human societies. By the end of this exploration, you will see the towering Alps not as a permanent barrier, but as a dynamic ancient highway. What drove people to risk everything crossing these frozen peaks, and what forgotten treasures did they carry with them? How does a piece of leather change our entire understanding of the past? The ice holds stories of connection that challenge our deepest assumptions about isolation and survival. What does it mean to discover that our ancestors were far more connected than we ever imagined? That shoe is more than an artifact. It is a direct message from a specific day, perhaps 5,000 years ago, when its owner stepped onto the ice. This is the profound difference between a glacier and a traditional archaeological dig. In soil, only the most durable materials survive: stone, pottery, maybe metal. But ice is a different kind of keeper. It is a frozen library, wood and fabric. The science behind this is a form of natural cryopreservation. When an object becomes trapped in glacial ice, it is sealed in an environment that is consistently cold, dry, and stable. The freezing temperatures halt the biological processes of decay, the lack of liquid water prevents rot, and the immense pressure of the overlying ice squeezes out oxygen, further slowing any chemical breakdown. A piece of fruit, a wooden tool, a woven basket, materials that would turn to dust in a few centuries under soil, can survive in this state of suspended animation. So when a glacier recedes, it is not merely revealing a lost object, it is thawing a single frozen moment. Think of it like opening a time capsule that was never meant to be opened, preserving a snapshot of life with a clarity that ground archaeology can only dream of. The retreating ice is turning the pages of a history book we never knew was written. And on those first pages, we are not reading about kings or conquests. We are reading about a traveler, a piece of their clothing, and the path they chose to walk. What story does that path tell? That frozen moment was first introduced to the modern world not by a shoe, but by a man. In September 1991, two hikers in the Alps spotted a body emerging from the melting ice. This was the Iceman, a traveler from over 5,000 years ago, preserved with a detail that stunned the scientific community. He was not a king or a warrior found in a grand tomb, but an individual caught in a moment of hardship. His discovery was the key that unlocked the door to this frozen library. Studying gave us our first clear portrait of life in the Neolithic Alps. His gear told a story of remarkable sophistication and connection. He carried a copper axe, a technology that required knowledge of smelting and access to ore sources that were not local to that high valley. His clothing was a carefully assembled toolkit for survival, stitched together from the skins of different animals, showing advanced tailoring skills. Even his medicine kit contained a type of birch polypore fungus, known for its antibacterial properties, indicating a deep understanding of the natural world. This was not a primitive wanderer. This was a well-equipped person, moving through a landscape he knew intimately. His very presence at an altitude of over 3,200 meters on a high mountain pass is the critical clue. It proves these peaks were not just terrifying, impenetrable barriers. They were pathways. Himself was likely on a journey, connected to a web of roots and relationships that span the region. He embodies the human element of this story, a reminder that these vast, abstract trade systems were made up of individuals, each with their own purpose, carrying tools, ideas, and materials from one place to another. His story is the powerful prologue, But if represents a person using the network, what reveals the network itself? What artifacts speak not of personal journey, but of deliberate, widespread exchange? The answer to that question lies in a single, extraordinary mountain pass. High in the Swiss Bernese Alps, at a place called the retreating ice in the summer of 2003, revealed a piece of leather so perfectly preserved it looked like it could have been dropped the week before. It was part of a legging, a simple item of clothing designed for warmth and protection. That one piece of leather was the first thread pulled from a frozen tapestry. As archaeologists returned to the site over the following years, the melting ice surrendered an entire traveler's kit. They recovered a birch bark quiver, finely crafted arrows, a fragment of a wooden bow, and several shoes. Each item, preserved in stunning detail, was a clue. But the most telling clues were not the objects themselves, but what they were made of. Analysis showed that some of the materials, like the specific types of wood and leather, likely originated from different ecological zones, from valleys south of the Alps to forests farther north. This was not a collection of things gathered from one local area. This was an assembled kit, carried by someone who had access to resources from across the region. The pass was not an accidental crossing point or a desperate escape route. It was a known and maintained corridor, a prehistoric highway operating nearly 5,000 years ago. The traveler who left these items behind was equipped not as a survivor, but as a professional, moving with purpose and preparation. Their gear speaks of a deep, practical knowledge of the mountains and of the connections that made such a journey worthwhile. So what could possibly be valuable enough to justify such a treacherous, high-altitude trek? What was being carried along these icy highways that made the risk acceptable? The most telling clues about these journeys are often the most fragile. Alongside tools and clothing, the ice has preserved something even more intimate: the remains of meals. In several high passes, researchers have recovered tiny caches of organic material, seeds of grains like barley and millet, dried berries, and even fragments of what appears to be dried meat or cheese. These are not the scraps of a desperate scavenger. This is a carefully considered traveler's ration pack. Think about what this selection represents. Grains provide sustained energy, berries offer essential vitamins and a morale-boosting taste of sweetness, and preserved proteins deliver crucial fats and strength for the grueling climb. This is a menu designed by experience. It shows a deep, practical understanding of human nutrition and the specific demands of high-altitude exertion. Furthermore, some of these foodstuffs, particularly the cultivated grains, could not have been gathered in the immediate Alpine environment. They were farm products carried up from the valleys. This transforms the story from one of mere survival to one of sophisticated provisioning. Someone or some community planned for this journey. They packed supplies that were lightweight, perishable, and dense, knowing exactly what would be needed to fuel a body crossing a mountain. It speaks to a tradition of mountain travel where knowledge was passed down, where the risks were known, and the preparations were meticulous. The journey was a calculated enterprise, not a reckless gamble. So we have the traveler equipped with superior gear. We have the highway marked by their passage. We have the supplies carefully packed for the long haul. All of this points to a journey with a clear and valuable objective. What precious cargo was so important that it justified this entire, perilous logistical operation? The cargo that justified these journeys was both practical and profoundly symbolic. Traders were not moving ordinary goods. They were transporting materials that represented the cutting edge of technology and the height of social status for their time. Picture a high-quality piece of flint or chert, sourced from a specific quarry hundreds of kilometers away. This stone was not just any rock. It was the premium raw material for crafting sharp, reliable tools and weapons. Its value lay in its consistency and workability, qualities that local stones often lacked. Then there was copper, emerging from early mining areas in places like the Austrian Alps. This soft, malleable metal represented a revolution. It could be shaped into axes, ornaments, and tools that held a keen edge longer than stone, marking a shift in human capability. Possessing a copper axe was not just about utility, it was a statement of connection to a new and powerful knowledge network. But the trade flowed in all directions. From the far north, along routes that seem impossibly long, came amber. This fossilized tree resin, golden and warm to the touch, washed up on the shores of the Baltic Sea. To carry a piece of amber across the continent and over the Alps was to carry a piece of captured sunlight, often fashioned into beads and pendants of immense social and possibly spiritual value. Other commodities were more fundamental to life itself. Salt, essential for preserving food and enhancing flavor, was a mineral treasure. Prized animal skins and furs provided not just warmth, but also displayed wealth and rank. Even perishable goods like honey, a rare and powerful sweetener, or specific medicinal herbs with known healing properties, could have been part of this high-altitude commerce. When archaeologists mapped the discovery sites of these materials against the emerging glacial finds, a pattern begins to solidify. A piece of Baltic amber found in a high pass does not represent a single, bizarre loss. It is a data point. It traces one segment of an invisible corridor that linked the Baltic forests to the Mediterranean sun. Similarly, a distinctive type of flint found far from its only known source quarry sketches a line on a map that no road follows today. These materials were the economic drivers. They connected regions rich in a specific resource with communities that desired or needed it, creating a web of interdependence that spanned the entire Alpine region and beyond. The value of these goods did more than motivate travel. It necessitated the development of a sophisticated knowledge network. This leads to the next great puzzle. With no maps, no compasses, and no written guides, how did these prehistoric traders navigate such a vast and treacherous labyrinth of rock and ice? Navigating this landscape required a form of intelligence written not on parchment, but into memory. These travelers moved without compasses or drawn charts, guided instead by a rich oral atlas passed from one generation to the next. Their maps were built from stories and careful observation. A distinctive rock formation, a particular bend in a valley where the sun set at a specific time of year, the behavior of migrating birds, even the subtle sound of wind through a certain pass, all served as waypoints. They learned to read the stars for direction and to understand the seasonal language of the mountains, knowing which passes would be clear of deep snow in late summer and which sheltered valleys offered the best campsites. This was a deep geographical intelligence, a mental map curated and refined over centuries. The proof is in the pattern of the finds themselves. Artifacts are not scattered randomly across the Alps. They cluster in specific high calls and passes like the, indicating these were not accidental crossings but recognized and remembered corridors. The same routes were used repeatedly for thousands of years. This consistency tells us the knowledge was communal. It was a form of cultural treasure, more valuable than any single piece of amber or copper, because it was the key to accessing all of it. Losing this knowledge meant losing the network itself, so the roots became embedded in myth and instruction, taught to the young through narrative and guided practice. This was their ancient GPS, a system built on experience and trust. Yet even the most detailed mental map has its limits against raw, physical terrain. To translate that knowledge into safe passage, these travelers needed a specialized toolkit. What kind of equipment could make a vertical world of ice and rock traversable? The technology that made these journeys possible is written in leather and thread. Among the most telling finds are the shoes, like the exquisite shoe discovered in a Norwegian ice patch. This was not a simple leather sack. It was a sophisticated piece of footwear engineering designed for a hostile environment. Its sole was made of sturdy hide, but the true innovation was inside, stuffed with a thick cushion of dry grass. This grass acted as a disposable, renewable insulating layer, absorbing moisture and trapping warmth, a clever solution that could be replaced on a long journey. The upper was carefully shaped and secured with an intricate lacing system, allowing for a snug, adjustable fit that prevented snow from entering and minimized painful rubbing on steep inclines. This same principle of specialized design is seen in the leggings from the pass. They were tailored, not draped, cut to allow for a full range of motion while climbing and crafted from materials that offered protection against the abrasive rock and biting wind. Compare this to the clothing worn by centuries earlier. His outfit was a layered system, a patchwork of different animal skins chosen for their specific properties, some for durability, others for warmth, all sewn together with remarkable skill. His bearskin hat, his grass cloak, each piece addressed a distinct challenge of the Alpine environment, from insulation to weatherproofing. This was not crude, makeshift gear. It was the product of generations of trial and error, a refined technology born from intimate experience with the mountains. The craftsmanship represents a significant investment of time and specialized skill, pointing to individuals in these societies who were not just travelers, but experts in outfitting for high-altitude travel. The very existence of such equipment suggests a cultural value placed on mountain mobility, where the knowledge to create these tools was preserved and honored. With this refined toolkit in hand, and the mental maps to guide them, what ultimately dictated when the ancient traveler would step onto the ice? What invisible calendar told them it was time to go? The ancient calendar was not marked on stone, but written in the retreat of snow. For all their knowledge and equipment, these travelers were governed by a force far greater than any human planning, the relentless rhythm of the Alpine seasons. Their window for crossing the highest passes was astonishingly narrow, perhaps just a few weeks each year. They waited for the late summer sun to melt back the deepest winter snowpack, revealing the rocky trails beneath, yet they had to complete their journey before the early autumn storms arrived, sealing the routes once more under fresh, impassable snow. This was not a leisurely hike, it was a race against a seasonal clock. The artifacts themselves act as frozen timekeepers, marking this precise window of opportunity. Finds are almost always discovered at the very edges of what was permanent ice, along the lines of ancient snowfields and glaciers. These were not places for year-round settlement, they were the highest practical passage points, the brief corridors that opened only when conditions were exactly right. A dropped shoe or a lost arrow at these altitudes is not a random accident. It is a signal flare from a specific moment in the annual cycle. It tells us someone was here when the passage was open. This creates a pulsed rhythm in the archaeological record, not a constant flow. Trade across the Alps was a seasonal surge, an intense burst of movement and exchange that required entire communities to coordinate. Harvests had to be gathered, goods had to be prepared, and travelers had to be, all timed to the mountain's unforgiving schedule. The climate did not just influence commerce, it dictated its very calendar. This understanding casts today's rapidly melting glaciers in a new and urgent light. As the permanent ice retreats further and faster than it has in, It is revealing artifacts from time periods and altitudes we never expected. Objects are emerging from ice that, for the entirety of recorded human history, has never thawed. This means we are accessing passages and time windows that were sealed shut long before the Romans ever laid a road. While this gives us an unprecedented view into the past, it also permanently alters the very archive we are studying. Each artifact pulled from the thawing ice is a page removed from its context, a data point from a seasonal clock that is now running in fast forward. Our changing climate is allowing us to read this ancient calendar for the first time, even as it irrevocably erases the frozen conditions that wrote it. So what happens when we follow these emerging clues not just to lost objects, but to the very people who coordinated this vast, seasonal enterprise? Who managed the knowledge, the goods, and the risks of crossing a continent over its roof? The very ice that preserved these artifacts is now vanishing before our eyes. This is the profound paradox of our moment. The same global warming driven by human activity over the last century is acting as an unintentional and relentless archaeologist. It is peeling back the frozen pages of this library at a rate far faster than we can possibly read them. For thousands of years, the glaciers held their secrets in perfect stasis. Now they are surrendering them all at once in a torrent of meltwater. This creates an unprecedented scientific opportunity paired with an acute crisis. Every leather shoe, every wooden bow, every fragile piece of clothing that emerges from the ice is experiencing a second death. After 5,000 years in a deep freeze, these materials are suddenly exposed to sunlight, bacteria, and the elements. Without immediate intervention, they can rot away in a single season. This places modern researchers in a desperate race against time, a salvage operation on a continental scale. The field of glacial archaeology was born from this urgency, a discipline defined by the very climate change that threatens to erase its subject. Scientists have had to develop entirely new methods for this frantic work. Teams now conduct systematic surveys along the edges of shrinking ice patches and glaciers, often using helicopters to access remote sites at the precise moment they become exposed. They work with mountain guides and even hikers, creating networks of citizen scientists who are trained to recognize and report finds without touching them, preserving the fragile context. When an artifact is located, the recovery is a careful ballet of documentation. Everything is photographed in its precise location recorded with GPS. The surrounding soil and ice are sampled for clues about the environment when the object was lost. Only then is the item gently collected, often needing to be kept cold and wet during transport to a lab, mimicking its icy tomb to prevent sudden decay. In the laboratory, the real work begins, using tools like mass spectrometry to identify ancient proteins and radiocarbon dating to pinpoint the age of a piece of wood or leather. This is history revealed under duress, a treasure hunt where the landscape itself is disappearing. Each recovery feels like a rescue, saving a fragment of human story from being lost forever to the thaw. It presents a stark ethical dilemma. Our pursuit of knowledge is made possible by the same planetary changes that are erasing the very conditions that created that knowledge in the first place. We are learning about ancient adaptability in the face of a changing climate, even as we witness the consequences of our own. This raises a haunting final question. As we piece together these roots and lives, what does their world, revealed by our warming one, ultimately tell us about our own? The story of these mountain highways does not end with the Neolithic era. It deepens, layer upon layer, across centuries. To see this long timeline written in ice, we travel north from the Alps to the mountains of Norway, to a place called the Ice Patch. Here, the melting snow revealed not a single artifact, but an entire scattered archive of travel, spanning from the Bronze Age over 3,000 years ago, all the way into the Viking Age 1,000 years later. This is not one lost moment, but a chorus of voices from different epochs, all speaking from the same frozen pass. Among the finds are humble, telling objects. There is a simple woven tunic, a personal garment lost to the cold. There are scattered piles of ancient horse dung, a seemingly mundane detail that speaks volumes, and then there is a wooden ski. This ski is a quiet revolution in understanding. It is not a modern recreational design, but a practical, ancient transport tool. Its discovery proves that these travelers did not merely endure the snow, they mastered it. They developed specialized technology to move efficiently across the deep winter pack that lingered on high passes, extending their travel seasons and expanding their reach. The horse dung is equally transformative. It tells us these journeys were not solely made on foot by lone individuals. Pack animals were part of the equation. Horses could carry heavier loads of trade goods, moving more material over greater distances. This shifts the scale of what was possible. It suggests the movement of small caravans, organized trading parties that could transport significant quantities of goods like pelts, antler, or dried fish from the northern mountains down to settled communities. The site, with its artifacts scattered across 1,000 years of history, offers something rare: chronological depth. It proves this mountain pass was not used once during a favorable climatic period and then forgotten. It was a persistent feature on the mental map of the region, a reliable corridor that generations knew and used, adapting their tools from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age to the Viking era. The route itself became a tradition. But with objects emerging from the ice without the neat layers of a traditional dig site, how do we know when a wooden ski or a piece of horse dung is from the Viking Age and not the Bronze Age? How do we date these fleeting, frozen glimpses? The wooden ski carries no written date, yet science can read its age in the very fibers of its wood. This is the quiet magic of glacial archaeology, where a mysterious object is transformed into a precise historical marker. The primary tool for this is radiocarbon dating. All living things absorb a tiny, consistent amount of a radioactive form of carbon from the atmosphere. When a plant or animal dies, this absorption stops, and that radioactive carbon begins to decay at a known, steady rate. By measuring how much remains in a sample of leather from a shoe or a strand of grass from its insulation, scientists can calculate, with a small margin of error, when that organism died. This gives the artifact a window in time, often pinpointing a century or two. But for wooden objects, an even more precise calendar exists, one written in nature's own archive, dendrochronology, or tree ring dating. Each year, a tree adds a new growth ring. In good years, the ring is wide; in difficult years, it is narrow. This pattern of wide and narrow rings creates a unique fingerprint for the climate of that specific period. Scientists have built master chronologies, continuous sequences of these ring patterns that stretch back thousands of years, using wood from ancient buildings, bogs, and other dated sources. When a researcher takes a sample from that ancient wooden ski or arrow shaft, they can match its pattern of rings against the master chart. If the outer ring is intact, they can often identify not just the century, but the exact year the tree was cut down to make the object. Imagine holding a piece of wood and knowing it came from a tree felled in the spring of the year 294. Suddenly, that artifact is no longer from the vague Viking Age. It is from a specific season in a specific person's life. Beyond dating, newer techniques like stable isotope analysis read the chemical story locked inside. Water and soil in different regions have distinct chemical signatures, which are absorbed by plants and then by the animals that eat them. By analyzing the isotopes in a piece of leather or a bone fragment, researchers can often suggest where that animal lived or grazed, offering a clue to the geographical origins of the material itself. This scientific toolkit stitches the frozen finds into a coherent timeline. We can now see that the pass in the Alps saw its heaviest traffic around 4,500 years ago, while the pass in Norway was busiest over 1,000 years later during the Viking era. Each dated object becomes a pin on a map of human movement, allowing us to chart the rise and fall of these icy highways across. With a firm date finally attached to these emerging treasures, we can place them against the backdrop of known history and ask, what world events or climatic shifts prompted a surge in travel? Or led to a mountain pass being abandoned for good? A copper axe found in northern Italy tells a silent but powerful story. Its metal did not come from the local riverbeds. Chemical analysis traces its origin to specific ore deposits high in the Austrian Alps, hundreds of kilometers to the northeast. That single object, therefore, is not just a tool, it is a completed journey. It is the final product of a chain of events, a chain that archaeology is now reconstructing. To understand the network, you must follow the material. Picture that axe blade, shaped and sharpened in an Austrian valley. It then begins a journey, likely carried up and over a high pass like the in Switzerland, a route we know was active from the artifacts left behind there. From that pass, it descends into the southern valleys and eventually reaches its final resting place in Italy. This is not a guess, it is a material trail. The axe is one data point. A piece of Baltic amber, found melted out of a glacier in the Swiss Alps, is another. Its origin lies over 1,000 kilometers to the north. To get from the Baltic coast to the heart of Europe, it would have traveled along river valleys and lowland trails. But its presence in the high mountains indicates that the final leg of its incredible journey went directly over the Alpine roof. These are not isolated curiosities. They are pins in a vast, invisible map. When researchers plot the locations of these exotic materials against the sites where local gear, like the shoes and leggings, are found, a pattern emerges. The high mountain passes become the pivotal knots, where long-distance luxury routes intersected with local, practical pathways, used for moving everyday goods like salt, hides, and grain between summer and winter pastures. This was a layered system. Some routes functioned like local footpaths, connecting adjacent valleys for community exchange. Others were the equivalent of ancient interstate highways, carrying prestige goods and cutting-edge technologies across the continent. The web was dynamic, not static. It pulsed and shifted with the rhythms of the outside world. A period of favorable, warmer climate might open higher passes for longer seasons, encouraging more traffic. The emergence of a new political power or a conflict in one region could reroute trade for centuries, sending caravans over different mountains to avoid trouble. A technological leap, like the widespread adoption of pack animals evidenced by that ancient horse dung, could increase the volume and speed of exchange, making once marginal routes economically vital. The glacial evidence gives us frozen snapshots of this web at specific moments in time. Each artifact cluster is like a single frame from a long film, showing the network in operation during a particular century. When we string these frames together, the cumulative image is undeniable. The Alps were not a wall, they were a sponge, a connective tissue absorbing and channeling the flow of people, ideas, and innovation. This realization forces a fundamental question about identity. If goods, styles, and technologies were flowing so freely over these peaks, then the cultures living on either side were far less isolated than we once believed. Who, then, were the weavers of this web? They were not a single people or a unified empire. They were the mountain communities themselves, the herdsmen who knew every valley, the craftsmen who understood which materials were worth carrying, and the traders who built relationships of trust across linguistic and cultural divides. They were the individuals whose lost belongings we now hold, the anonymous engineers of a continent's first great infrastructure, a network built not of stone, but of knowledge and daring. Etched directly onto the face of the mountains themselves, these travelers left behind tools but never a written name or title. So who were they? The objects themselves whisper possibilities. The finely tailored leggings and specialized shoes suggest more than a farmer on an occasional errand. They hint at individuals for whom mountain travel was a regular part of life, perhaps even a profession. Yet the seasonal nature of the crossings also points to people whose primary identity was tied to the land, like herders moving livestock to summer pastures, who used their deep geographical knowledge to transport goods on the side. They were likely both, a fluid combination of specialist and seasonal traveler, depending on the era and the route. Evidence from valley settlements far from the ice helps complete this portrait. In lower altitudes, archaeologists find workshops with exotic materials like the distinctive Alpine flint or copper from distant sources. These were nodes in the network, places where raw materials were transformed into valuable goods, ready for the next leg of their journey. The presence of such workshops implies a level of social organization that could support specialization. It might point to emerging hierarchies, where local leaders or kin groups controlled access to these valuable resources and the profitable routes that carried them. But control is only one side of the story. The vast distances and diverse cultures involved required something more fundamental than power, trust. The most likely glue holding this network together was kinship and reciprocity. A trader moving from the north into the Alps would not have been entering a void. They were likely moving toward known contacts, perhaps linked by marriage alliances or long-standing ceremonial friendships. These relationships created obligations of hospitality and safe passage. A trader was part diplomat, relying on a web of social bonds that turned strangers into guests and dangerous trails into protected corridors. Their most valuable cargo was not the amber in their pack, but the relationships they maintained and the knowledge they carried between worlds. What motivated societies to invest in these risky, generation-spanning connections? The answer lies in resilience. No single valley was self-sufficient. A community rich in copper ore might lack high-quality flint for tools. A group with access to premium salt deposits might crave the warm glow of Baltic amber for ceremonial display. These trade routes were a prehistoric form of risk management, a way to buffer against local shortages and to access innovations. Maintaining a tie with a distant group meant securing a flow of information as vital as any material, news of climatic shifts, new technologies, or potential conflicts. The mountain passes were not just economic channels, they were lifelines of information, weaving isolated groups into a larger, interdependent human tapestry. The motivation was survival, enriched by connection. The glitter of amber or the gleam of a copper axe was about far more than utility. These exotic items were a form of ancient social currency, tangible proof of connection to a wider, more sophisticated world. To possess something from beyond the horizon was to hold a story of distant lands and daring journeys, a story that elevated the owner's status within their community. A leader who could distribute such rare goods strengthened their influence, weaving a web of obligation and loyalty. Trade, therefore, was not merely an economic act. It was a performance of power and a ritual of social bonding. The movement of materials facilitated the movement of people, and with them, the quiet exchange of genes, reducing the genetic isolation of high valley populations and fostering a biological resilience to match their social one. But perhaps the most profound cargo was intangible. Alongside the packs of salt and bundles of furs traveled ideas. A new method for hafting an axe, a more efficient way to smelt copper, a different style of pottery decoration, or even a fragment of a new myth or song. These were the invisible treasures that flowed through the mountain passes. This constant, low-level exchange of knowledge meant that a technological breakthrough in one valley could, within a few generations, ripple across the entire Alpine region. A community was never truly alone with its problems. It was part of a silent, continent-wide conversation in innovation. This created a form of prehistoric interdependence. A village specializing in fine leatherwork might trade its goods for grain from a farming settlement lower down, and both might rely on a third group from a distant pass for their supply of critical medicinal herbs. These relationships, built on mutual need and reinforced by generations of exchange, formed a social safety net woven across the peaks. Alliances were not sealed with treaties, but with the regular, reliable flow of goods and the kinship ties that grew around it. The entire system was a brilliant adaptation to a fragmented landscape, turning geographical barriers into connective tissue. Yet this delicate web of social and economic life was perpetually vulnerable to the most powerful force of all, the climate itself. How did the great warming and cooling cycles of prehistory dictate the pulse of this ancient commerce? The climate stage was never still, and its script is written in ice. To understand the rhythm of those ancient journeys, we must read a different kind of frozen archive, one not left by people, but by the atmosphere itself. This is the science of paleoclimatology, and its most powerful record comes from deep within the glaciers. Scientists drill long, cylindrical cores from the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, and from the high alpine glaciers themselves. These cores are like frozen time capsules, capturing layer upon layer of accumulated snow year after year for hundreds of thousands of years. Within each layer, a wealth of data is locked away. Tiny bubbles of ancient air, sealed as the snow compressed into ice, preserve the very composition of the atmosphere from that exact moment. Dust particles carried by winds from distant deserts or volcanic eruptions settle as visible bands. The chemical signature of the water molecules, their isotopes, fluctuates with the temperature at which the original snow formed. By reading this layered code, climatologists can reconstruct a year-by-year diary of Earth's past climate, with a precision that often rivals the rings of a tree. This environmental diary allows us to set the human story from the passes against the backdrop of planetary change. We can identify major climatic episodes that would have directly dictated the opening and closing of the high corridors. For instance, a period known as the Holocene climatic optimum, a prolonged warm phase that peaked around 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, likely created favorable conditions. With warmer temperatures and reduced ice cover, many high mountain passes would have been accessible for longer seasons, perhaps encouraging the establishment and frequent use of routes like the traffic we see from that era might be a direct reflection of a warmer, more permissive climate. Conversely, researchers have identified a pronounced cold and wet period, often called the Iron Age Cold Epoch, spanning roughly from about 900 to 300 years before the Common Era. During such a phase, glaciers would have advanced, would have lowered, and the window for safe passage would have shrunk dramatically or slammed shut entirely. The archaeological record seems to echo this. In several key passes, there is a noticeable gap in finds during these centuries. It suggests that communities, faced with a relentlessly advancing ice front, were forced to abandon corridors that had been reliable for generations. They would have had to seek lower, longer, and potentially more politically complicated routes, or see certain exchanges cease altogether. The climate did not just influence trade, it could rewrite the entire map without a single human decision. This creates a profound dialogue between the two frozen records. On one hand, we have the personal artifacts, the shoes and bows, speaking of individual choices and journeys. On the other, we have the ice cores, speaking of global forces that made those choices possible or impossible. A cluster of artifacts from a specific century is not just evidence of human activity, it is a response to an environmental invitation. A layer of thick dust in an ice core from a massive volcanic eruption might correlate with a sudden absence of finds, as ash clouds darkened skies, disrupted weather, and made travel perilous. Climate provided the ever-shifting stage, and human ingenuity wrote the script upon it, adapting, rerouting, and persevering. This interplay raises a compelling and urgent question for our own time. If a gradual cooling over centuries could close a mountain highway, what might a sudden, rapid warming do? And could these routes have ever faced a catastrophic closure, not from a slow advance of ice, but from a single, devastating event? The silence of these mountains is a story in itself. For every successful crossing marked by a dropped tool, there must have been journeys that ended without a trace. The artifacts we find are not always neat collections, waiting to be rediscovered. Sometimes they are scattered. A single arrow here, a broken piece of a container there, objects separated by dozens of meters of ice and rock. This scattering is a clue, a frozen moment of chaos. It suggests a sudden, violent event, a storm that blew in without warning, or the distant rumble of an avalanche sweeping down a slope. While direct evidence is exceptionally rare, the landscape itself testifies to the ever-present danger. These travelers equipped themselves not for a pleasant hike, but for a confrontation with raw, unpredictable power. Their sturdy shoes with grass insulation were not just for warmth, but to prevent frostbite in a blinding blizzard. Their layered clothing was a shield against wind that could steal body heat in minutes. Every piece of gear we recover speaks to an intimate understanding of risk, a lifelong calculation made with every step onto the high ice. The very existence of this specialized technology is a monument to the peril it was designed to overcome. When we hold a 5,000-year-old legging, we are holding a piece of someone's preparation against a disaster we can only infer. These objects become their own kind of memorial. A lone shoe, perfectly preserved, is no longer just an artifact. It is a quiet echo of an individual's journey interrupted. It represents a story that will never be fully told, a connection between valleys that was severed on a mountain pass. This adds a profound layer of meaning to the glacial archive. We are not just mapping commerce, we are encountering the human cost of ambition and connection. Each find is a dual record of both vibrant life and silent loss, preserved together in the cold. The ice that kept these items safe may very well be the same force that claimed them. This presents a deep responsibility for those who find them today. How does modern archaeology approach these fragile, poignant clues with the respect they deserve? Transforming them from tragic tokens into keys for understanding the moment an artifact thaws is the moment its second race against time begins. For these objects preserved in a deep freeze, exposure to sunlight, air, and microbes triggers a rapid countdown to decay. A piece of leather can begin to curl and disintegrate within days. A wooden arrow shaft can splinter and rot in a single season. This reality transforms archaeologists into high-altitude first responders. Their work is no longer a slow, methodical dig. It is a salvage operation governed by the pace of the melt. Teams, often a mix of professional researchers and trained local volunteers, must monitor vast, remote ice patches and glaciers, sometimes returning to the same site week after week as the summer sun peels back new layers of ice. They work in a landscape of profound silence and scale, where the only sound might be the wind and the distant trickle of meltwater. Their toolkit is as diverse as their environment, containing not just trowels and brushes, but climbing gear, satellite phones, and specialized cold storage containers. The goal is not merely to collect, but to document a context that is literally vanishing before their eyes. Every step is meticulous. Before an object is even touched, it is photographed from every angle, its position pinned with precise GPS coordinates. Samples of the surrounding ice and soil are collected, capturing microscopic clues about the environment the day the item was lost. Only then, often with hands numbed by the cold, is the artifact gently lifted and immediately sealed in a sterile, chilled environment, mimicking its icy tomb to slow the sudden shock of decomposition. This is archaeology fused with emergency medicine, where the patient is a fragment of human history and the clock is ticking louder than ever. The modern glacial archaeologist must be part mountaineer, part scientist, and part historian, a unique born from a unique planetary moment. They are the direct witnesses to a library, dissolving as they try to read its pages. So where do these rescued fragments go? And how do we learn to read the stories they have been holding? The rescued artifacts begin their most delicate journey in a laboratory, not a museum gallery. This transition from a frozen mountain slope to a stable display case is a feat of modern science, a race against decay fought with painstaking care. Take a piece of leather, like that ancient shoe. For 5,000 years, its structure was held rigid by ice crystals. Thaw it rapidly, and those crystals melt, causing the fibers to collapse into a shapeless, brittle mass. To prevent this, conservators use a process called freeze-drying. The artifact is slowly frozen again in a controlled chamber, and then, under a vacuum, the ice is gently converted directly from a solid to a vapor, bypassing the liquid stage that would cause damage. The result is a stable, dry object that retains its original shape and detail. Wood presents a different challenge. Saturated with water, it will warp and crack catastrophically as it dries. The solution is a slow, years-long bath in a wax-like substance called polyethylene glycol. This compound gradually replaces the water molecules within the wood cells, providing internal support and allowing the artifact to dry without distorting. Once treated, these objects enter a new kind of prison, a climate-controlled vitrine where temperature and humidity are monitored with the precision of an intensive care unit. A fluctuation of just a few percentage points in humidity can cause irreversible stress. This creates an immense ethical and practical burden for museums. Acquiring a glacial find is not a one-time event. It is accepting a permanent, expensive responsibility for a fragment of history that will require vigilant, costly care forever. The commitment is as monumental as the mountains the objects came from. To share these treasures without subjecting them to constant risk, many institutions are turning to digital curation. Using three-dimensional scanning and photogrammetry, specialists can create hyperrealistic digital models of an artifact. These models can be rotated, measured, and examined in microscopic detail by a researcher on the other side of the planet, or explored by a student in a classroom. All without the original ever leaving its carefully guarded case. This digital twin becomes a powerful tool for both preservation and democratization, ensuring the knowledge survives even if the physical object faces an unforeseen threat. But why go to such extraordinary lengths? Because these physical objects are not just curiosities, they are direct tests of our historical theories. For generations, scholars relied on durable stone and metal finds to map the past, which often suggested isolated, inward-looking mountain cultures. A bronze dagger in a valley tomb fit that narrative. But now, a simple leather legging from a high pass, dated to the same era, tells a contradictory story. It is a data point of movement and connection that the dagger alone could never provide. Each perfectly preserved stitch, each choice of material, directly challenges old assumptions of isolation. They force us to rewrite the map, not with speculation, but with physical evidence carried by someone who was there. Preserving these objects is how we preserve our newfound ability to listen to those ancient travelers, to let their lost belongings question the stories we thought we knew. For generations, the story of Europe's early mountain peoples was one of isolation. Historians and archaeologists looked at the towering peaks and saw a natural fortress, a barrier that sealed communities into remote valleys, forcing them to develop in cultural solitude. Cut off from the innovations and currents of the wider world, this was the persistent myth of the isolated Alpine community. It was a logical assumption, born from the sheer physicality of the landscape. How could anyone, without modern technology, maintain consistent contact over such a formidable divide? The mountains, it seemed, were the ultimate wall. But the artifacts emerging from the ice tell a completely different story. They are the physical rebuttal to that centuries-old assumption. The sheer volume and staggering variety of local materials, copper from the east, amber from the north, flint from distant quarries, does not suggest occasional, desperate contact. It reveals a pattern of sustained, deliberate exchange. These communities were not isolated. They were the networkers, the facilitators, the vital links in a chain of connection that stretched across the continent. The mountains were not a wall, they were a bridge, and the people living among them were the engineers who maintained it. This is a fundamental paradigm shift in how we understand European prehistory. It moves Alpine societies from the forgotten periphery of the historical map directly to its bustling crossroads. They were not passive recipients of ideas trickling in from more advanced lowland centers. They were active, dynamic participants in a continent-wide conversation, controlling the flow of goods and, by extension, the flow of power and innovation. This rewrites the narrative from one of stagnation to one of sophisticated mobility. So what do the specific materials themselves tell us about the nature and depth of these connections? Each category of trade good acts as a different kind of signal. The copper axes and daggers represent the movement of cutting-edge technology and the specialized knowledge required to work it. Their presence in valleys far from ore sources signals not just trade, but the transfer of technical know-how. The Baltic amber beads, warm and golden, speak of social and possibly spiritual value, items that conveyed status and told a story of incredible journey simply by being worn. The high-quality flint from specific geological sources points to the establishment of reliable, long-term supply chains, where the quality of the material was so consistently valued that people were willing to traverse incredible distances to secure it. Even the more mundane goods, like salt for preservation or certain medicinal herbs, reveal a practical interdependence. No single valley was self-sufficient, and these trade routes functioned as a prehistoric lifeline, a system of mutual support woven across the peaks. The evidence suggests these were not anonymous transactions. The consistency of the roots over implies relationships, alliances forged through kinship or reciprocity, where a trader from the north was not a stranger, but an expected guest with ties to a specific family or group. This network was built on trust as much as on economics. It was a social fabric, resilient and adaptive, that turned geographical barriers into connective tissue. The glacial finds force us to replace the old map of isolated cultural islands with a new one, a map of dynamic interchange, where an idea born in one valley could, within a few generations, echo in another 100 miles away, having passed directly over the roof of the world. This realization connects these ancient Alpine traders to a much larger, older human story, one that spans the globe. A single arrow shaft can trace a line across a map of Europe. In the wetlands of Denmark, far from any mountain, a place called revealed a staggering deposit of thousands of weapons, deliberately placed in the bog as ritual offerings centuries after the Common Era began. Among the spearheads and swords were arrow shafts, simple wooden cylinders that held a silent revelation. Scientific analysis showed these shafts were crafted from yew and ash, two tree species that did not, and could not, grow in the local Danish environment. Yew, in particular, was prized for its unique combination of strength and flexibility, the perfect material for a reliable bow and its ammunition. Its presence there spoke of a procurement network operating on a continental scale. To supply the ritual needs of a Danish community, traders or suppliers were reaching south, likely into the forested foothills and valleys of the Alps and Central Europe, where high-quality yew and ash flourished. This distant bog becomes a mirror, reflecting the economic reach of the Alpine world. It shows that the mountains were not just a local crossroads. They were a node in a supply chain that fed the spiritual and military needs of societies hundreds of miles to the north. The same forests that provided materials for a traveler's bow in a Swiss pass might also have provided the wood for an arrow offered to the gods in Denmark. This parallel transforms our understanding of scale. We move from seeing individual journeys over a specific pass to recognizing a vast, integrated economic sphere. The Alps were a resource hinterland, an engine of production whose outputs, like premium wood, metal ores, and perhaps skilled leather goods, flowed out along these invisible channels to meet demands in places the mountain dwellers might never even see. This raises a pivotal question. With artifacts now scattered from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, how do we stop merely collecting dots and start connecting them into a coherent picture of the system itself? A broken arrow shaft lies on a laboratory table. To an untrained eye, it is just a piece of old wood. But to a researcher, it is the first sentence of a story waiting to be translated. The process of building a coherent narrative from these glacial clues is a meticulous form of detective work, where intuition is guided by science and every assumption must be tested. It begins with the artifact itself, the primary clue. That piece of wood is not just measured and photographed, it is asked a series of questions. When were you made? Where did you come from? Who carried you, and why were you lost here? Radiocarbon dating provides the first answer, placing the arrow in a window of time, perhaps the late Bronze Age around 3,000 years ago. Stable isotope analysis might then suggest the type of environment the tree grew in, hinting at a geographical origin. This single clue now has a tentative time and a possible place on the map. The next step is comparison. The researcher pulls records from a database of other glacial finds. Was a similar type of arrowhead found 50 kilometers away in a different pass, dated to a similar period? was a shoe with a distinctive stitching pattern discovered in a valley to the south, made from leather that matches the animal species used for the archer's quiver. These are the connections that transform isolated dots into a pattern. Each artifact stops being a solitary loss and becomes part of a constellation of evidence, all pointing to activity along a specific corridor during a specific era. But the pattern alone is not the story. The narrative emerges when this pattern is laid over the backdrop of the wider world. This is the stage of contextualization. The researcher consults the Paleoclimate records from ice cores. Was the late Bronze Age a period of warming that would have opened high passes for longer seasons? They look at the archaeological record from settled valleys. Was this a time of population growth, technological change like the spread of metalworking, or social shifts that might have increased demand for long-distance trade? Suddenly, that lone arrow shaft is no longer just a hunting tool. It becomes a data point in a story of opportunity. It suggests that during a favorable climatic window, communities leveraged their knowledge to increase exchange, carrying new technologies and social goods over the mountains to meet rising demand. The narrative that coalesces is not one of random wandering, but of deliberate, adaptive strategy. It is a story of humans reading their environment with acute sensitivity, identifying brief windows of possibility in the relentless Alpine seasons, and mobilizing complex social and logistical networks to act within them. This synthetic thinking, this weaving of disparate threads into a single tapestry, is the true heart of historical mystery solving. It turns science into story and fragments into a legacy of human resilience. Yet this entire endeavor, this race to collect and interpret, rests on a foundation that is literally melting away. Our ability to read this story is born from the same planetary changes that are erasing its original context. This presents a quiet, profound ethical dimension to the work. We are benefiting from a loss. The very crisis that threatens global ecosystems is gifting us an unparalleled view into the past, even as it destroys the frozen conditions that preserved it. Researchers must grapple with this paradox every time they lift an object from the softening ice. They are not just collectors, they are stewards in a moment of unprecedented transition, rescuing fragments of human memory from the thaw their own civilization has accelerated. The ethical charge is to treat each clue not as a trophy, but as a sacred trust, a voice from a world that mastered the climate of its time, speaking directly to a world struggling with the climate of its own making. A single artifact emerging from the ice can belong to two nations at once. High mountain passes, the very corridors of ancient connection, often lie directly on modern political borders. When a melting glacier on the boundary between Italy and Switzerland reveals a Neolithic legging, a pressing question arises beyond its age or origin. Which country holds the right to recover, study, and display it? This is not merely a legal formality, but the first layer of a deep ethical puzzle that glacial archaeology must now solve. The work unfolds in a space where scientific urgency meets profound questions of cultural ownership and respect. For artifacts linked to early cultures, the claimants may not be modern nation-states at all, but indigenous communities whose ancestral ties to the landscape span. A Sami reindeer herder in Scandinavia, for instance, might see a 1,000-year-old wooden sled fragment not as a data point, but as a direct link to their cultural heritage and traditional knowledge. The right to interpret such an object, to decide its meaning and its future, becomes a conversation about voice and authority. Who gets to tell the story of this frozen past? Is it solely the domain of the academic institution that funds the recovery, or does a share of that authority belong to the descendants of the people who created it? Modern archaeology is increasingly navigating these waters through collaboration, seeking partnerships with indigenous groups from the very start of a project to ensure their perspectives guide the process. This shifts the dynamic from one of extraction to one of shared stewardship, acknowledging that some stories are not just found, but inherited. This leads to a second, more paradoxical layer of ethics. The recovery missions themselves, for all their noble purpose, carry an environmental cost. Researchers and support teams travel to these remote sites, often by helicopter or in fuel-consuming vehicles, to save objects from a melt caused by global carbon emissions. There is an undeniable tension in burning fossil fuels to rescue history from the consequences of burning fossil fuels. Does this contradict the very message the melting ice conveys about human impact on the planet? Teams are acutely aware of this irony, and many are adapting their methods to minimize their footprint. They optimize logistics to reduce trips, use electric vehicles where possible, and partner with local mountain guides who can access sites on foot or ski, turning necessity into a principle of minimal impact. The goal is to ensure that the act of preservation does not become another chapter in the story of degradation. This careful balancing act reflects a broader truth, that in the 21st century, no discovery exists in a vacuum. Every rescued arrow or shoe is now part of two narratives: the ancient story it tells of human adaptation, and the modern story it embodies of our relationship with a changing Earth. Looking forward, the future of these icy archives is uncertain in more ways than one. The most immediate threat is the sheer pace of loss. Scientists estimate that based on current warming trends, the vast majority of alpine glaciers could be functionally gone by the end of this century. The library is not just being read, it is dissolving. This imposes a finite deadline on the salvage operation, compressing perhaps a century of potential research into a few decisive decades. The race is not just to collect objects, but to collect enough overlapping evidence to reconstruct the full network before its individual points vanish forever. Beyond the physical salvage, the future also hinges on how we choose to value and share this knowledge. Will these artifacts remain locked in specialized academic papers, or can they be woven into the public understanding of climate change and human history? Digital technologies offer a powerful path forward, creating immortal, accessible twins of fragile originals that can be studied and experienced globally. Perhaps the ultimate legacy of these glacial finds will be a new map, one that layers ancient human pathways over modern political borders, reminding us that connection has always been more powerful than division. It challenges us to consider what roots we are building or breaking in our own time. As the last pages of the frozen library are turned, what final, unifying message might they hold about the species that wrote them? The timeline for this frozen library is now alarmingly clear. Current climate models project a stark future for the Alpine glaciers, one that moves with a speed that defies the slow patience of ice. Based on the trajectory of warming, many of the smaller, lower-altitude glaciers that have been the richest sources of artifacts are forecast to disappear completely within the next few decades. By the end of this century, the majestic ice fields that have defined these mountains could be reduced to a few remnant patches at only the very highest, coldest peaks. The environment that acted as a perfect time capsule for over 5,000 years is entering its final chapter. For glacial archaeology, this creates a paradoxical race. The melting that reveals the treasures is the same force that will ultimately destroy the unique conditions that preserved them. We are in a brief, closing window of opportunity, perhaps just a few decades long, to recover what we can before the deep freeze permanently switches off. Artifacts that emerge from the ice and are not documented and collected in time will face rapid decay, their stories dissolving into mud and runoff, lost forever. This casts the work of the teams on the mountainside in a new, urgent light. They are not merely conducting research, they are executing a historic salvage operation, a last-chance effort to pull pages from a book that is burning. Every recovered shoe, every scanned arrow shaft is a rescue. This urgency connects directly to a deeper, more philosophical question about legacy. For generations, we have relied on natural archives like ice, bogs, and permafrost to preserve the intimate, fragile details of the human story that the soil could not hold. These environments have been our partners in memory, keeping safe the things we could not. As they vanish in a warming world, what will future generations use to understand the nuances of our past? If the ice is gone, what natural freezer will preserve the everyday objects of our own era for an archaeologist 10,000 years from now? The loss of these cryogenic archives is a loss of resolution, a blurring of the human picture. It makes the work happening right now, in this narrow window, not just important, but essential. It is a gathering of light before the lamp goes out. The story leaps forward over 2,000 years, but the mountains remain the same. In the pass of the Swiss Alps, the retreating ice revealed a different kind of traveler, a horse. Preserved alongside it were the remains of its rider, a journey frozen in the medieval period. This is not a prehistoric find, but a medieval one, a bridge across time. The discovery proves the mountain highways were not abandoned after the Neolithic or the Bronze Age. They remained vital arteries, pulsing with life and commerce straight through the era of castles and cathedrals, connecting the world we know from history books with the deeper past we are only now uncovering. The rider and his mount offer a more intimate portrait of medieval Alpine travel. The horse's equipment, the bits of bridle and saddle, can tell us about the breeding and training of pack animals during this era. Was this a sturdy local breed, adapted to the thin air and steep slopes, or was it an animal brought from farther away, indicating a trade in specialized transport? The rider's possessions, perhaps tools, coins, or personal items preserved in the ice, could reveal his origin, his destination, and the nature of his errand. Was he a merchant carrying wool or wine over the pass? A messenger on a diplomatic mission, a pilgrim on a sacred journey. Each possibility sketches a different line on the medieval map, connecting monasteries, markets, and noble courts across the peaks. This continuity is the profound message of the ice. The fundamental equation of mountain travel remained unchanged for. The challenges of altitude, weather, and terrain were constants. The purposes, trade, communication, pilgrimage, were enduring. What evolved were the technologies and the political landscapes. The medieval traveler might have had iron horseshoes instead of copper axe heads, and he might have been navigating territories ruled by local lords rather than tribal kin groups. But his journey was part of the same ancient rhythm. The pass find collapses time, showing a direct lineage of human ambition. It tells us that the knowledge of these roots was never truly lost, only passed down, adapted, and sustained across countless generations. The ice does not just preserve individual moments, it preserves a continuum of endeavor. This raises a compelling parallel. If the Alps hold this frozen chronicle of connection, what about the other great icy regions of the world? The story of high-altitude trade is not unique to Europe. From the icy passes of the Andes, where Inca messengers ran a vast empire along mountain roads, to the frozen expanses of the Tibetan Plateau, where ancient paths connected cultures across the roof of Asia. Humans have repeatedly turned forbidding landscapes into corridors of exchange. The artifacts may differ, coca leaves and precious metals in one region, tea bricks and silk in another, but the underlying narrative is strikingly similar. It is a global story of resilience, of communities mastering their most daunting environments not by conquering them, but by learning to move through them with purpose and skill. The melting ice, from the Rockies to the Himalayas, is beginning to tell these stories too, suggesting that the urge to connect across the highest places is a shared chapter in the human story. The same story of ice and enterprise is being written on every continent where mountains touch the sky. Far from the Swiss passes, in the high Andes of Peru and Argentina, melting glaciers are surrendering artifacts of the Inca Empire and the cultures that preceded it. Researchers have recovered remarkably preserved offerings left at ceremonial sites, known as high on the volcanic peaks. These finds, often including delicate textiles and statuettes, speak not of casual trade but of profound spiritual journeys, where the arduous climb was an act of devotion, connecting the earthly realm to the celestial. The frozen trails of the Andes reveal a network where faith, as much as commerce, motivated people to master the vertical world. Meanwhile, in the far north, the Yukon Territory of Canada tells a different, yet parallel tale. Here, it is not glaciers but permanent ice patches, often on sun-drenched slopes, that have preserved a staggering record of ancient hunting. As these patches shrink, they are releasing perfectly preserved dart shafts, sinew cordage, and even the remains of caribou hunted thousands of years ago. These are not trade goods, but the tools of subsistence, marking seasonal hunting corridors used for generations. The ice patches functioned as natural freezers, where a successful hunt from one summer could be cached and retrieved the next, a brilliant adaptation to a cyclical life. And back in Scandinavia, beyond the pass, other melting sites continue to add chapters to the Viking Age, revealing lost saddles, sledges, and clothing that detail the everyday mobility of Norse farmers and traders across their own formidable terrain. This global chorus of melting ice sings a unified theme. Whether it is an Inca child's llama figurine placed on a Peruvian summit, a hunter's atlatl dart lost in a Yukon forest, or a Viking horse's bridle discarded on a Norwegian mountain, the underlying narrative is one of human ingenuity in the face of immense geographic challenge. These cultures, separated by oceans and never communicated with one another, yet they each arrived at the same brilliant conclusion. They looked upon the most intimidating, frozen parts of their world and did not see a dead end. They saw a corridor. They recognized that these high, cold places, while dangerous, offered direct lines of travel, access to unique resources, and pathways to the sacred. The specific purposes differed: commerce, ceremony, hunting, but the foundational behavior was identical: the transformation of barrier into bridge. This global perspective does not diminish the uniqueness of the Alpine finds. It amplifies their significance. Each discovery becomes a local dialect in a universal human language of exploration and connection. By comparing the techniques, the grass-stuffed shoes of the Alps versus the tailored fur clothing of the Yukon, we see a dazzling diversity of solutions to the same fundamental problems of warmth, mobility, and survival. This comparative view enriches our understanding of each culture's specific genius, while highlighting a shared, species-wide trait: an unstoppable drive to reach, to connect, and to move through the world regardless of the obstacles placed by nature. It suggests that this urge to traverse the highest and coldest places is woven deeply into our collective story, a testament to a resilience and curiosity that defines us. That shared drive to connect across the highest places points toward something deeper within us. The evidence from the ice, from the Alps to the Andes, synthesizes into a single, powerful theme. It reveals a human imperative that transcends any one culture or era, the relentless drive to connect, to exchange, and to explore. These prehistoric travelers did not cross the mountains on a whim. They systematically developed specialized knowledge, refined their technology, and built the social structures necessary to make these journeys possible, all for the purpose of trade. This suggests something profound about our species. Trade is not merely a luxury that emerges only after civilizations become complex and settled. It appears to be a fundamental impulse, a core cultural behavior as ancient as community itself. For these Alpine societies, trade was a brilliant strategy for risk mitigation. No single valley had everything it needed to thrive. By establishing connections over the peaks, they created a safety net, a way to buffer against a failed harvest, a shortage of critical materials, or simply the desire for something new. It was a practical form of resilience, weaving isolated groups into a web of mutual support. But it was always more than just an economic transaction. The movement of goods facilitated the movement of people, and with them, the exchange of ideas, stories, and innovations. A new method for hafting an axe or a different style of ornamentation could travel along the same path as a piece of amber, seeding change and fostering adaptation. This network was a silent engine for cultural and technological evolution, operating before written history. The melting glaciers provide us with the physical, undeniable proof of this ancient form of globalization. They show that interconnectedness is not a modern invention of the digital age or even of the classical empires. It is a deep, recurring chapter in the human story, written again and again by people who looked at a mountain and saw not a barrier but a gateway. This reframes trade entirely. It moves from being a dry economic activity to a vibrant cultural behavior, a manifestation of curiosity, ambition, and social intelligence. So how do we, sitting in our connected modern world, relate to these ancient travelers staring up at a glacial pass? We recognize their motives in our own. The desire to reach beyond our immediate horizon, to acquire something rare or useful, to share knowledge, and to build relationships that span distances, these are not quaint historical footnotes. They are the same impulses that drive online communities, global supply chains, and scientific collaboration today. We are still the same species, seeking connection, mitigating risk through networks, and turning obstacles into routes. Their story, preserved in ice, is ultimately a reflection of our own enduring nature. Their leather shoes are gone, but the map they followed is still being used. We may not shoulder a pack of amber to trade, but we engage in the same fundamental act of connection every day. Think about the device you are using to listen to this story. It is a culmination of materials sourced from mines on multiple continents, assembled in one country, designed by teams collaborating across oceans, and delivered to you through a digital network that moves information at the speed of light. The scale and speed are unimaginable to a Neolithic traveler, yet the underlying principle is identical. We rely on vast, invisible networks to bring us what we need and desire, from the food in our kitchens to the ideas in our minds. Our journey is not across a physical pass, but through a labyrinth of digital marketplaces, social platforms, and global supply chains. We prepare for these journeys not by stuffing grass into our boots, but by researching products, reading reviews, and building online reputations. The risk we calculate is not of an avalanche, but of a failed transaction, a security breach, or misinformation. The reward remains the same, the acquisition of something valuable, whether it is a tangible object, a piece of knowledge, or a meaningful connection with another person. The landscape has transformed from rock and ice to fiber optic cables and data streams, but the human navigating it is driven by familiar urges. We seek to reduce our isolation, to access resources beyond our immediate reach, and to share a part of ourselves with a wider world. Their trade routes were etched by footfalls over generations, ours by clicks and algorithms, yet both are testaments to a species that refuses to be contained by geography. This shared impulse to connect suggests that the story of the melting glaciers is not a remote historical footnote. It is a prologue. It is the earliest physical evidence of a behavioral blueprint we are still following. The ancient traders teach us that adaptability is not about having the most advanced tool, but about possessing the most resilient mindset. They did not wait for the mountain to change. They learned to read its moods and move within its rhythms. They turned scarcity into opportunity by building bridges where maps showed only blank space. In our era of rapid climate and technological shift, their legacy is not a specific route, but a methodology. It is the courage to look at a barrier, whether glacial or digital, and see a corridor waiting to be defined. Their frozen belongings are a mirror, showing us that the core challenges of journey, trust, and exchange are timeless. What new mountains are we learning to cross today? And what fragile evidence of our own passage might we one day leave behind their history in reading the signs of a shifting world? For those ancient Alpine communities, climate change was not a distant theory, it was the lived rhythm of their existence. They navigated not one stable environment, but a series of climatic pulses, warm periods that opened high corridors and cold snaps that sealed them shut for generations. Their survival and the vitality of their connections depended on a profound, attentive relationship with their surroundings. They observed the retreat of, understood the language of migrating birds, and remembered which springs flowed in a dry year. This deep environmental knowledge was their most vital tool, allowing them to anticipate change rather than merely react to it. When a pass they had used for centuries became choked with advancing ice, they did not abandon the idea of connection. They adapted. They sought new, if longer, routes through lower valleys, or they shifted the timing of their journeys, or they developed new technologies like those grass-insulated shoes to extend their season. Their trade networks were not rigid highways, but flexible, living webs that could be reconfigured when one thread was cut. This adaptability was woven into their very material culture, a constant process of innovation in response to necessity. There is a powerful lesson here for our own moment of profound planetary shift. We cannot copy their specific solutions. We do not need to rediscover the art of stuffing grass into footwear, but we can emulate their foundational attitude. They approach their changing world not with paralysis or denial, but with clear-eyed observation, practical ingenuity, and a commitment to communal response. Their resilience was a social project, built on shared knowledge and mutual dependence across valleys. In our era of anthropogenic climate crisis, where the changes are global and accelerated by our own actions, the scale is different, but the essential challenge of adaptation is the same. Their story, revealed by the very ice our warming world is melting, urges us to cultivate that same deep literacy of our environment, to build systems that are flexible and redundant. And to remember that our greatest resource in uncertainty is not technology alone, but the strength of our communities and the wisdom of our collective observation. The ultimate significance of these melting secrets, then, is not just a rewritten map of the past, it is an invitation. As we hold a 5,000-year-old shoe, we are holding proof of a mindset that turned obstacles into pathways. The glaciers gave up these artifacts as a final message, a reminder from the deep past that the human story has always been one of navigating change, of looking at a mountain and seeing not an end, but a beginning. What we choose to build with that knowledge, what new routes we chart through the challenges of our own century, will be the artifact we leave for the future. The final picture is not painted by a single science. To solve the mystery of the ice, you need a chorus of voices. An archaeologist can date a wooden arrow, but a climatologist must explain why the pass was open that particular century. A geologist can trace the origin of a stone tool, while a materials scientist deciphers the tanning process of a leather legging. Historians then weave these threads into the broader tapestry of human events. This is not just cooperation, it is a fundamental synthesis. The story of prehistoric mountain trade could not be told by any one field working alone. It is a perfect case study in the necessity of an interdisciplinary lens, a model that reaches far beyond ancient glaciers. Our most pressing modern challenges, from climate adaptation to public health, are similarly complex webs. They cannot be solved by economists or engineers or ecologists in isolation. They demand the same kind of holistic vision, where data from satellites is read alongside social patterns and economic models. Just as the ice required archaeologists to think like climatologists, our future requires us to think across all the boundaries we have built. This historical mystery matters precisely because it dismantles the silos that separate our understanding of the world. It proves that the environment is not a backdrop for human history, it is an active character in the plot. A shift in global temperature patterns, read from an ice core, directly enabled or halted the movement of people and ideas across a continent. This deep interconnection between climate and culture is the silent lesson echoing from every melting pass. Recognizing this changes everything. It means we can no longer study human societies as if they existed in a vacuum, nor can we examine planetary systems without considering the human ingenuity and vulnerability woven through them. The greatest revelation from the ice is not a specific route or artifact. It is the demonstration that to understand any part of our story, we must be willing to see the whole. The prehistoric trader, the medieval writer, and the modern scientist are all part of one continuous endeavor, the human quest to comprehend our place within a vast and changing world. The frozen library offered its pages not to a single specialist, but to a united community of curiosity. In that shared act of discovery, we find a map not only of ancient mountains, but of how to navigate the complexities of our own time. This revision of history is written not in stone, but in leather and wood thawing into our hands. The melting Alpine glaciers have gifted us a profound new narrative, one that replaces a map of isolated valleys with a vibrant web of prehistoric highways. Each artifact, from sophisticated toolkit to the medieval writer's equipment, is far more than a relic. It is a testament to a fundamental human truth, the enduring, ingenious drive to reach beyond our immediate horizon and forge connection. For thousands of years, we looked at these towering peaks and saw an impenetrable wall. Now, we understand they were the very opposite dynamic corridors pulsing with the movement of culture, commerce, and curiosity. The ice did not preserve a story of stagnation, but of constant, clever adaptation. This journey through frozen time reveals that the greatest barriers are often the ones we construct in our minds. The physical challenges of the Alps were immense, yet generation after generation met them with innovation, turning sheer rock faces and glacial passes into the most direct routes between worlds. They built a continent-wide network without a single written word, relying instead on deep environmental knowledge, resilient social bonds, and an unwavering will to connect. As the ice continues its rapid retreat, it leaves us with a dual and urgent responsibility. First, we must act as stewards in a race against time, preserving these fragile, thawing echoes before they are lost to decay and runoff. Each recovered object is a rescued voice, a crucial piece of a puzzle we are only now assembling. Second, and perhaps more importantly, we must heed the profound lessons these ancient travelers offer. They mastered a changing climate not with force, but with observation and flexibility. They built resilience through interdependence, understanding that no community was an island. In our own era of global connection and climatic shift, their legacy is a powerful mirror. They challenge us to look at the modern mountains we face, the divisions and obstacles of our own time, and to see not dead ends, but potential corridors. They remind us that the human story has always been one of finding a way across, of turning barriers into bridges through ingenuity and shared purpose. The final message from the melting ice is one of hope and continuity. We are the inheritors of that same resilient spirit. The prehistoric traders with their grass-stuffed shoes and mental maps are not distant, alien figures. They are us, in a different landscape, solving the same eternal problems of journey, trust, and exchange. Their story, now emerging into the light, invites us to consider what roots we are building for the future, and what fragile, beautiful evidence of our own passage we might one day leave behind. If this exploration of our glacial past resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into history's deepest mysteries. We would love to hear your thoughts on these ancient networks in the comments below. What connections in our own world remind you of these prehistoric pathways? Thank you for listening.